Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Bishop from The Economist magazine, and it's great to be here this afternoon, continuing our long and fruitful partnership with the Earth Institute to discuss, I think, probably what is the crystallizing number that really puts in focus so many of the challenges that we on The Economist write about when we think about the future of our world, but also the Earth Institute thinks about, how does our planet sustain a population that either has or is about to or may do in a few years' time, go through the 7 billion number. I think we probably think it has now passed 7 billion, but Joel, our first speaker, will no doubt correct us on that. But how on earth does our planet sustain that amount of people? And to kick us off, we have a keynote presentation from Joel E. Cohen, who is the Professor of Populations at the School of International and Public Affairs here, as well as at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. After Joel speaks, and he's asked me to give him the shortest possible introduction, which I've just done, we're going to have a panel discussion which will initially react to what Joel has to say, featuring Ruth de Vries, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, Utmano Lal, Klaus Lackner, and, of course, Jeff Sachs. And then I will have a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to engage as much of the audience as possible, both here in the hall, but also on Twitter, where we will be monitoring comments, and they'll be rushed to the front, so we have plenty of interaction with people around the world, as well as here in the building. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joel Cohen. Joel.
Hello, everybody out there. I can barely see. Thank you, Matthew, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming out to talk about a topic that is of importance and interest. The outline of my talk is there. I want to begin with some questions which I will largely not answer. The rest of our conversations may approach an answer. Then I'm going to talk about the world population past and present, good news and bad news, and then briefly about what's ahead and what we ought to do. And in principle, I'm going to do all of that in the next 29 minutes. Let's see, if you divide 7 billion into 29 minutes, that's quite a bit per minute. So here's the question I think we would like to be able to answer. Can Earth support 7 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion people in a good life for a long time? I haven't defined what a good life is because I won't make that decision in the future. The answers depend on the choices we and future generations make. I haven't defined what a good long time means. That depends on individuals' time perspectives. But I want to focus for opening on a specific subset of this rather large question. And the question is, when you think about ingredients in the world today, one major player is national democracies. And a second major theme in the world today is globalization. And a third major theme is sustainability. And I want to ask the question, can we have all three at the same time? Are sustainability, globalization, and national democracies compatible? And the argument I would make is it's not obvious that they are. And so what I've put, I'm abbreviating a rather long argument because I haven't defined what I mean by national democracies, globalization, or sustainability. And so I'm going to rely on your intuitive judgments about that, and we can come back to that. But I've put on a diagram here the spatial scale on the horizontal axis from local on the left to global on the right, and the temporal scale on the vertical axis from short term, your next quarterly report, your next election, to long term. And by long term, I'm thinking of the typical life of a species with hard body parts, which is about 4 million years from the fossil record. So it's on the scale of the existence of the human species. We've been around for a fraction of that. But let's take a couple of million years. I'm not talking about the death of the sun in a few billion years. I'm talking about something that's relevant to human existence. And my argument is that these ellipses represent what I take as the center of value and incentives. In elections, a democratic leader has to respond to local concerns in a sufficiently reliable way to get elected at the next election. Even though the actions a democratic leader may take may spill over beyond the borders of the country to influence the entire world. Farm subsidies in the US influence the prices of food in Africa. The CAFE standards for emissions, miles per gallon on the fleet, influence carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One could go on and on. So officials and voters respond to local incentives, but there are spillovers globally and for a long term. The scale of the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere 90, 100 years. There are different turnover times, but that's a typical number. At the top of the picture, sustainability covers the local to the global scale. We want to preserve our rare endemic species. We don't want pollution in our drinking water here. We've got to protect the whole atmosphere. The ozone hole that just appeared over the Arctic is a global phenomenon. And so sustainability covers the entire spatial scale, but with a long time perspective. And then there's globalization here. And globalization looks for the cheapest producers and the markets anywhere and the resources anywhere. When I was walking in Ireland, I came across some men picking up an old truck that had driven off the road. They were putting it on a tow truck, and I started talking to them. I said, "It's great that you're cleaning up the countryside." And they said, "We're not cleaning up the countryside. The price of scrap iron is $100 a ton in China. This truck is going to China." So globalization is like that. Resources everywhere are a subject for markets everywhere. The actors are governments in local democracies and voters, businesses in globalization, and non-governmental organizations, usually not-for-profit, in sustainability. The challenge is, who acts here in the interface between those three domains of interest? I think there's a gap in our palette of global institutions to bring those concerns together. So that's the idea that's behind the specific details that I'm now going to zip through about world population. You're asking yourself, why is this guy talking about these things? We're here to talk about 7 billion. Well, I believe my mental model for thinking about population consists of a tetrahedron with population, economics, the environment, and culture as the nodes of this tetrahedron. It's really just a checklist. And culture includes national democracies. Economies include globalization. The environment includes sustainability. And all of these interact with all the others, and that's what's hard to think about. So I'm going to give you some specifics about population and emphasize the interactions with these other dimensions. Okay, so now this is the day of 7 billion. I don't know whether it was with a sense of humor or just in ignorance of local traditions that the UN Population Division put the date on Halloween, October 31. Last summer, they put it in, 2 years ago rather, they estimated that it would be in August 2011. The Census Bureau estimates it's going to happen in March 2012. Well, the truth is, we have never censused the entire Earth. The censuses we have are infrequent and incomplete, and the U.S. Census, which cost billions, has an error of 1% to 2%, according to the census. Now, since we're growing at 1% per year, it means that in time, the date of 7 billion could be a year ago, this year, next year. Okay? So that's the real range of uncertainty, as Matthew pointed out earlier. And here are the landmarks. We're at 7 billion down here. It took 12 years since we were at 6 billion, 1999. It took 12 years before that when we were at 5 billion, 1987. It took 13 years before that when we were at 4 billion, 1974. It took 14 years before that when we were at 3 billion in 1960. The addition of 4 billion people in 5 decades, half a century, has no precedent. That is an exceptional event and will probably never be repeated in human history within the next few centuries for sure. Beyond that, I don't know. It took at least 120,000 years to put the first billion on, and then there was the Industrial Revolution after the 1800, and the second billion took only 130 years, the third billion only 30 years, and then we entered this extreme explosion. So now I'm going to give you a sequence of good news, bad news. I wish I could see what I set up there more easily. Does this thing move? No, I'm tethered. Okay, well, I'm going to come around here. Excuse me if I turn my back on you for just a second. There, okay. I'm tethered, but mobile. So the good news is that life expectancy tripled. Human life expectancy tripled in historical times. We're now at about 70 years, and maybe that's our greatest achievement. But huge gaps remain. In Central African Republic, male life expectancy is 44.5 years versus Japan and Switzerland, 79.3. If that phone call is for me, would you please hang up for me? More good news. Fertility fell by half. The average number of children per woman fell from 5 in 1950 to about 2.5 now. The growth rate was peaked at about 2.1 or 2.2% in the 1960s when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, and it's now down by half to 1.1% a year. The decline in average numbers of children per woman makes it possible for families and societies to focus on the quality of children rather than the quantity. And it may be that focus which has caused the decline. So I'm not speaking about directional causality. And this is a picture just to show you. Is there a slide? No, there seems to be no laser pointer. Okay. Well, if you look over here, the green X is for world. It's in the middle. It starts at 5 on the left, comes down to about 2.5 in 2010, and approaches 2. Everything to the right of 2010 is wishful thinking. We hope that the fertility will converge to about the replacement level of about 2.1, but we certainly don't know that, and we don't know the rate of convergence. That is a hope, not a fact. More good news. By 2005, half women of reproductive age who were married or in a union were using a modern method of contraception. 68% were using some form of contraception. What about the other women? We'll come back to them. Modern contraception gives women and men self-governance, saves the lives of mothers who would otherwise die in childbirth, and avoids millions of abortions to terminate unplanned pregnancies. These gains can be celebrated by people who oppose and those who support safe, legal abortions. More good news. The decline of childbearing from high levels raised the ratio of workers to dependent children. If you put less children at the bottom of the age pyramid, then the fraction of the population in the working ages goes up for a while until this pig works through the python, the pig being the high working age population. And some countries with good governance and education, like China, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, reaped the demographic dividend of higher economic growth rates. Material wealth grew. The human capacities to produce and consume material wealth exploded. So I'll just skip here. The GDP per person grew from 666 in 1820 to 7614, that's more than tenfold, in 2008 in constant dollars. Some people were getting richer, but not everybody. The good news is that education spread. In Latin America, in 1900, 30% of children were enrolled in primary school. I'm using the gross enrollment ratio, and I'm not going to go into the details. 100%, 101% by 2000. In East Asia, 21% to 110. Southeast Asia, 4% to 104. Sub-Saharan Africa, even though Sub-Saharan Africa was the lagger, it went from 16 to 85. So culture, we talked about education, that's part of culture. We talked about economics, that's the income. We talked not yet about the environment. Well, let's now go over to the bad news, and we'll talk about the environment when we get to that topic. It's incredible that 3.4 billion people, about 48% of the planet, have daily incomes of $2 or less. Try to imagine your life under that constraint. Well, there's nobody in the developed world who can do that. In China, the world's second largest economy, 36% live on less than $2 a day. In India, 76%. 3 Indians out of 4 live on less than $2 a day. The average income this year is $28 a day, $28 a day. So they're living on about 1/14 or less of the average. This gap in income has led to a gap in wealth, or vice versa. The top 2% of people have 51% of wealth, while the bottom 80% of the people, the bottom 8 of those 10% chunks, have less than 10% of all the wealth. As a result, the number of people living on $2 a day or less at least doubled in the 20th century. How can I say that? Well, we've got 3.4 billion people living on $2 a day or less. In 1900, there were only 1.7 billion people. So, or 1.6, we don't know exactly. So even if all of them lived on $2 a day or less, we've doubled the absolute number of people living in poverty. And 0.8 billion live in slums, and 8 billion adults, mostly women, are illiterate. However that's defined. This is life between the poor in the foreground and the rich in the background in Bangalore when I was there in 2003. The average number of children per woman in the least developed countries is 4.5 compared to 1.7 in the more developed countries. And children suffer disproportionately from poverty because they're 41% of people in the least developed countries, but only 16% of people in the more developed countries. More Bangalore. This is rubble on a construction site, temporary dwellings, and families with lots of children. If you plot the average number of children born per lifetime on the vertical axis and the average income per person by country, you see this scoop. If you put it on a log coordinates, it's a straight line. There's a power law relationship. Basically, multiplying your income by 10 reduces your total fertility rate by half. And you see the outliers. Niger, up there at 7.4. For its income, Saudi Arabia and Equatorial Guinea have very high fertility. Bad news. a billion hungry people. And how you define it gives you a different number between 850 million and 925 million. The bottom line is that more people are chronically undernourished now than in the last 40 years. These are estimates from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Nearly a billion people. 98% of those were in developing countries. In the United States, do you know how many households in the last year did not have enough money to buy food for their members? 1 in 7, with a total of 48 million people. Across the middle of Africa and South Asia, in many regions, more than half the children are stunted. Being stunted means of low height for your age as a result of chronic hunger. Their capacity for education, employment, health, and productivity is permanently reduced. Worse news, this hunger exists as a choice, not a necessity. The world produced 2.3 billion metric tons of cereal grains in the last completed crop year, 2009-10. You can do the calculation, and I'll be happy to spell it out. Enough calories to sustain 9 to 11 billion people, depending on whether you give them an average of 2,000 or 2,500. But only 46% of the grain went into human mouths. Animals got 34%, and 19% went into machines, biofuels, starches, plastics, and industrial purposes. So in round numbers, think of the food supply of grain divided into 6 equal pieces. You put 3 pieces in human mouths, 2 pieces in animal mouths, and 1 piece into a machine. That's why I say hunger is a choice. It's not a choice for the hungry, but it's a choice for the rest of us. More bad news. There were 208 million pregnancies in 2008. I don't consider that bad news. What I consider bad news is that 86 million of them, 41%, were unintended. These unintended pregnancies resulted in 33 million unplanned births. Well, the population was growing by about 75 million people a year. So if you could have eliminated the unplanned pregnancies and the unplanned births, you could have eliminated half of that growth. And you would have improved the lives of the children, the mothers, the fathers, and the societies. In the United States and Canada, we do better than the average. 48% of pregnancies were unintended, according to the most recent evidence. They resulted in nearly 1.7 million births. Compare that number with the estimated net migration into the USA and Canada, about 1.2 million people. When people complain about migration to the United States driving population growth in this country, they are ignoring the fact that 1.7 million unintended births result from very high numbers of unintended pregnancies. Each unintended birth averted in rich countries would reduce the rate of growth of material consumption much more than each unintended birth averted in poor countries. More bad news. Unintended pregnancy is not the whole problem. Let's take Niger. Niger has a total fertility rate of 7 children per woman. It's about 7.4, depending on whose estimate you use. That's the highest in the world. Contraceptives have been free in Niger since 2002. The median age of marriage is 15.5. Median age means that half the women are married before 15.5 and half after. And married women and men reported in 2006 that they wanted an average of 8.8 and 12.6 children, respectively. So the unmet need for contraception is very low in Niger. But the resources to take care of those children are also very low. And there is a problem of valuing quantity over quality. The other bad news is that the atmosphere, oceans, and continents are no bigger now than they were when humans evolved. But human demands on the Earth have grown enormously. I'm going to skip over the water slides because Upmanu Lal is going to deal with that better than I possibly could. Well, I'm going to just skip this. 1 billion people live with no appreciable supply of renewable fresh water. Okay. The atmosphere has not grown larger, but our CO2 inputs to it have grown enormously. And the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere rose 20% in the 20th century now alone. They're now higher than the last 150,000 years. We are a major player in the chemistry of the atmosphere. More land was converted to cropland in the 30 years from 1950 to 1980 than during the 150 years from 1700 to 1850. Agriculture uses 30, and that reduced biological diversity in both periods dramatically. Agriculture uses 38% of the ice-free land surface. This is what it looks like in Tulum, Mexico, when the local people want to convert a forest for grazing for cattle or for soybeans. And this is the 300-year history of the depredations of forests and woodlands and grasslands for the expansion of cropland and pasture. The part occupied by agriculture are the right segments. The non-food use of the ice-free land is on the left, about 2/3. And part of the reason there's a conflict is that goats like these in the Atlas Mountains eat everything that sprouts, and you see the not quite bare earth because there's some things they won't eat, but the impact on the environment there is colossal. This shows population density on the horizontal axis and forest coverage, the fraction of land covered by forests on the vertical axis, and the trend is clear. As density rises, forest coverage drops. There's a conflict between resources and dumps. When the world was big compared to human demands, resource extraction and waste disposal were compatible. Now, there's no way to throw things away to. When groundwater used for drinking receives unwanted agricultural runoff or wastes from hydraulic fracturing, resource and waste collide. When atmosphere regulates climate and accumulates greenhouse gases from burned fossil fuels, ecosystem services and wastes collide. What about the future? Well, I guess I have another 5 minutes or so. There's my crystal ball. The most recent population division projections envision 8 billion people in another 12 years, so we can meet again if we're still alive, by 2023, 9.3 billion by 2050, and 10.1 billion by 2100. India will have more people than China around 2020. Sub-Saharan Africa will have more people than India before 2040. In 1950, there were 3 times as many Europeans as Sub-Saharan Africans. By 2100, there will be 5 Sub-Saharan Africans for every European. That's a 15-fold change in the ratio. Could you imagine that that might have an impact geopolitically and on international migration? As fertility has fallen, the average number of children per household has declined. So as incomes have grown up, families have become smaller and households have become smaller. If each household has to have its own appliances, refrigerator, television, air conditioner, whatever, car, the smaller the average number of people in a household, the greater the number of appliances per person. Therefore, the greater the average energy demand per person. So our per-person energy demand is driven upward by our decline in fertility. There ain't no free lunch. There are trade-offs. Cities. What about cities? Well, sometime in the last couple of years, the number of urban people, the solid black line, matched and passed the number of rural people, however that's defined. the foreseeable increase from 3.5 billion now to 6.3 billion people in cities by 2050 will require the construction of a city of 1 million people every 5 days from now for the next 40 years. Just do the arithmetic. How many weeks are there in 40 years? 40 times 50 is 2,000. Plus or minus a bit, there are 2,000 weeks. 3.5 billion people, you can't pack 1 million people into a week. Just divide 3.5 billion by, the number of weeks. So, and half of the urban population growth by 2025 will occur in cities of less than 500,000. So small cities are the future of urban life, and we are not giving enough attention to the design of those cities for amenities and for efficiency and for preservation of the agricultural land around them. Many cities are located on prime agricultural land. If the doubling of urban population leads to the doubling of urban area, prime agricultural land could be removed from food production. A Japanese botanist friend of mine took this picture in the city where she lives in Japan, Fuji City. There are the houses and there's the rice field. One or the other is going to give way. Aging will go global. In 1950, there were 6 children under 15 for each person 65 plus. By 2065, elderly people 65 plus will I don't think 65 is elderly anymore. By 2065, people 65 plus will outnumber children less than 15. At that point, there will be 3 people of working age 15 to 64 who will support 2 dependents, 1 child and 1 elderly. Either that or the meaning of working age will change. I bet on the second alternative. The world will have fewer young than old people. Now, why does this not advance? Am I out of time? Are you trying to tell me to stop talking? Is there a chance you could advance this remotely? I need some help. Let's try reverse. Sorry. Is there a button I can push? I'm sorry, people. Well, you can remember this, right? What's going to happen? There we go. Okay. Thank you very much. So, what to do? This is my granddaughter. She was just born this year. Kind of cute, don't you think? And she has a very good chance of living to 2100. Very high probability. So she's interested in this discussion, although she's not here today. Is economic development the best contraception? That was a theme in the Bucharest conference in 1974, something like that. Or is voluntary contraception the best development? Is education of better quality and greater availability a key ingredient of all other strategies? Or does the world need a bigger pie, fewer forks, and better manners? Bigger pie means more productive technologies. Fewer forks means slower population growth. Better manners means fewer inequities, less violence and corruption, freer trade and mobility, more rule of law, less material-intensive consumption. Yes to all of these, but what are the priorities? Well, slowing population growth voluntarily will not solve all humanity's problems, but it will make it much easier to solve many of them by slowing ever-growing demands for more teachers, schools, jobs, appliances, energy, land, water, and food. And the time to act is today, because a difference of 1 child per woman per lifetime between now and 2050 means a difference of 2.5 billion people in 2050, if you compare the different projections. So these are my priorities: voluntary contraception and support services for all, universal primary and secondary education, and food for pregnant and lactating mothers and children under 5. Providing modern family planning methods to all people with unmet need would cost about $6.7 billion a year. For comparison, Americans are expected to spend $6.9 billion for Halloween in 2011. Americans have no reason to assume the whole burden, but they could afford to share with developing and other wealthy countries. The costs of attaining universal primary and secondary education by 2015, we don't know, but guesses range from $35 to $70 billion a year. For comparison, Americans actually spent $32 billion in 2011 for Valentine's Day and Mother's Day combined. I have nothing against these holidays. I'm just trying to set the scale of what the costs are. These are mutually reinforcing priorities. Reducing unintended pregnancies and unplanned births reduces the number of mothers and infants who have to be fed now and the number of school entrants later. Feeding mothers and infants improves their health and ability to learn. Educating all children delays the age of marriage and first birth, reduces the total number of children, improves survival of offspring, thereby reducing incentives for more children. Thank you very much for your patience. I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you, Joel. And if I could call up the panel to join us on stage now, we're going to have some reaction to your talk. We have, first of all, Ruth de Vries, who is the Denning Professor of Sustainable Development. Just come up on stage and I'll read your introductions out while you come up. And Chair for the Department of Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Biology. We have Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who's the Arnold Saltzman Professor of Professional Practice in International and Public Affairs and Director of the Center of International Conflict Resolution. We have Upmano Lal, who's the Albert and Carol Silberstein Professor of Engineering and Director of the Columbia Water Center. We have Klaus Lachner, who's the Ewing and J. Lamar Wurzel Professor of Geophysics and Chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering and Director of the Lenfest Center for Sustainable Energy. And of course, we have Jeff Sachs, who needs no introduction, because you all know him and love him and everything. So I want to start with you, Ruth. Just each of you will go down the line. If you give 3 or 4 minutes of instant reaction to what you've heard from Joel and what you think the priorities are in terms of answering that question which Joel ducked of whether the world can indeed sustain a population of 7 billion or more.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Joel, for that wonderful presentation. So another way to look at the 7 billion mark is as success. The goal of any species is to increase its numbers, to expand its niche, and by that metric, the human species is very successful. But also, like any other species, we use any resources we can get our hands on, and we generate waste. So if we think about the time that you spoke about, that this unprecedented increase in population over the past 50 years or so, there has been even a more unprecedented expansion in the use of resources. So the global economy has grown by something like 15 times, while the population has doubled. Motor vehicles have grown, the number of motor vehicles have grown by some 18 times, fertilizer use by 6 times, and the list goes on and on. And there's really no end in sight for that increase in consumption. While we see a decline in fertility, we don't see a decline in the consumption of resources. In fact, the opposite. We see an increase in the per capita use of resources, and we are also on the cusp of another great acceleration in economic growth, which is all to be celebrated as people strive and are able to maintain a good life. So I think the priority and question for us is, what really are the pathways to development, to creating good life, however that may be defined, that is less resource intensive, and we don't really have a clear pathway for that right now, although there are some signs. There are corporations who are looking at their supply chains, there are cities who are investing in low-carbon development, and so on. So I would ask you how you think we can combine the population and the consumption, while we see the population expecting to stabilize, but the consumption continuing to go up and up, and are the same approaches that we use for addressing the population helpful for addressing a low consumption pathway to development?
Great, thank you, Ruth. We'll come back and discuss that in a bit. Jean-Marie.
Well, what struck me in Joel's presentation is first that today we are aware that we are 7 billion. And in a way, in the past, we were never aware of how much the population of the world was 300 years ago. We had no idea. In a way, that's good news because it creates a measure of solidarity. But that's bad news because we're also aware of the immense inequalities. And I'm not sure we're going to do as much about it as we should. I think it's going to trigger a lot of mobility, both interstate mobility, you alluded to that, and I think it'd be very interesting to hear from you how you project that mobility. I mean, the figures that you gave us, for instance, on the ratio between the European population and Africa is an enormous, I mean, you can look at it as an enormous potential I mean, I'm a European, from a European standpoint, that here is next door a continent that can become a huge market. If you look at it from another angle, you can say here's a continent that still has only, I mean, still 15% are not going to school, and that can be seen as a threat. How are you going to manage that migration so that this aging continent of Europe benefits from it while managing the political tension is going to be a huge question. Another element that struck me in what you said was about urbanization, because I think that's going to change the face of conflict in a big way. When you live in small towns, when you live in rural areas, there are all sorts of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms that are at work. And they're not necessarily nice. I'm not advocating for the past, but they create a sort of stable equilibrium. The cities are the space of freedom since antiquity, since the Italian cities. But if we don't manage that other dimension of mobility, of cities that are no more under control, when I think of the megacities that we see now in Africa, I mean, when you think of Monrovia, when you think of Kinshasa, you see cities where the dynamics are no more under control, or even closer to us. I mean, a big city like Mexico City. We are, I think, going toward new types of conflict, urban conflict, and we haven't really thought through the implications of that. And lastly, you gave us macro figures, but for instance, you mentioned water. I think of Pakistan and the tension the need for water in a place like Pakistan. This growth of population, you stressed the example of Africa, but it's going to be very unevenly distributed. And so the tension for resources is also going to be very unevenly distributed, and that may well trigger some conflicts if we don't manage them.
Thanks. Amano.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up from your comments as well as Joel's. I think the comment I would like to start with from Joel is the growing inequity in income as a function of increasing population. And this, I think, is a very interesting point to note because, as Ruth said, our per capita consumption of resources has been increasing dramatically. Couple that with the inequity in income, and couple that with the fact that if we look at water, the defining issue with respect to water is a dramatic variability in the space and time availability of water. And that's where I think the real challenge comes, and perhaps the conflict note. Having said that, it's hard for me to buy the population projections for some of the regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and places which are completely devoid of these resources. As we look at those area's endogenous capacity of supporting a population, it simply doesn't match up with the kind of projections that we are looking at, which either means that there has to be mobility, or it means that there will be catastrophe in some sense in those areas. At the same time, if we look at the history of the 20th century, places such as India, which were similarly mocked in the 1960s, have had an apparently remarkable transition where famine is no longer an issue. Yes, there is drought, but there is a five-fold increase in agricultural productivity that seemingly has addressed the issue. Of course, we know that that has come at a price of fossil resources, for example, groundwater and energy. Yet, if we see the situation in a place like India, and we've been working now in many such places, what we see is that there are tremendous gains in productivity with respect to resources, land and water resources, that can be achieved. So the message that I think has come out of our work so far, and I would like to leave with, in closing, is the following. If we are going to make it to 10 billion or 12 billion or 20 billion, which is possible, the gains in productivity have to come from people who are the poorest, in a way. And the reason I say that is that if we can see a mechanism by which those people can be enormously more productive, both in terms of their economic development and their utilization of resources to improve their lives, then we can perhaps make it. If we rely on the opposite paradigm, which is to allow the rich to get richer in terms of both their use of resources and their productivity, this is not going to work.
Great. Klaus.
Well, when I was invited to this, I wasn't so quite sure why I'm invited. I'm thinking about energy and technology and not about populations. But then I started to think back how I got involved in all of this in the early 90s, probably a little closer to that 74 mark you were talking about earlier. And what struck me, energy is essential, and energy is essential as a means of giving the basic resource which underlies in many ways every other, and I can explain that a little more in a second. And you, at the same time, cannot ever defeat Malthus's argument that if population growth is exponential, you will lose. But I heard a little bit of optimism in your talk, and also just looking at the statistics. The population growth is slowing down. In a way, we are not exponential. If you simply take the numbers you put up at face value, the last 20 years we were about linear in the growth rate. And if you look at your projections, it's actually maybe coming to a stop. And I do believe there's this interplay in a way I don't understand, that better wealth, better education ultimately solves the problem. But that to me says that resource question, whether it's on the waste side or on the resource extraction side, on the agricultural side, absolutely needs to be solved. And to me, then energy just takes a very, very central role. And in a way, it's also the place where actually technology is not quite ready to solve the problem. We know there's plenty of energy in solar, in nuclear, in carbon itself, in fossil carbon for probably 100 or 200 years, if we are willing to clean up after ourselves and pay that extra to make that happen. But none of these technologies are quite ready. Solar has its problems by being still too expensive. Carbon capture and storage is still on the drawing board in some ways, even though it looks plausible. And lastly, nuclear energy, if there are three big bets, we may have just lost that one. Right? So overall, but with those in place, we could have water. We could clean up after ourselves. And to just give you a feeling how big our energy consumption today is, in the state of New Jersey, the per capita energy consumption exceeds the photosynthetic productivity of the same area, even if it were pristine. So we are running against those limits, and we may have to learn how to have technology help us out, and maybe carbon doesn't have to flow from the agricultural sector into the energy sector, but from the energy sector into the agricultural sector, because the energy sector ultimately is the bigger one. So I'm optimistic in a way that the technologies can be developed to solve the problem. But then I'm struck, and this is sort of what I really learned today, is your diagram where there's this gap in the middle. We don't think about how to get to the sustainable level, how to move forward. Where I'm pessimistic is in the societal structures which would enable us to actually deploy these technologies. and we could very well fall on our face in the next 30 years, which would, of course, also solve the population problem, but in a way you wouldn't like.
Jeff.
I wanted to pick up on a comment of Ruth's and then a comment of Joel's. I think Ruth made a very interesting opening observation, which is maybe from an ecologist perspective, this is a triumph. 7 billion individuals of this species, with a species of our biomass, mammalian species that would normally fit on a curve of other mammals of expecting maybe 5 to 20 million members of the species rather than 7 billion. So is this a great triumph? And of course, one can immediately raise 3 observations which I think are worth raising in response to that. One is that ecology teaches that there can be overshooting, and the basic dynamic equation of species niche dynamics, the Lotka-Volterra equation, has predators and prey chasing each other, so you can boom for a while, but you can eat yourself out of your own survival and expect a crash later on of population. And in a way, that's a metaphor for, of course, what we may be threatening ourselves with. Maybe literal in some sense, because we are eating the biodiversity and eating some of our literal prey, but also metaphorically because we're mining resources that are fossil resources that aren't coming back. I think the second observation, of course, is that in species niche theory, the quality of life per member of the species isn't well considered. So we may be 7 billion, but we might not be thrilled to be so crowded in terms of the implications for quality of life. And I think a third point is worth making, which is that even if we could, in some sense, sustainably spread the Homo sapien reach as wide as we have, the devastation to other species on the planet is no small thing. And there is good evidence that we are in the 6th massive species extinction on the history of the planet because of the incredible amount of primary production that we take as a species to maintain 7 billion of us. Joel made a point that is a great point. It was picked up by several people here, and I want to just amplify on that as my second comment. And that was the bicausal relationship that Joel pointed out at the end of his talk, that is it the case that contraception is the best development tool and development is the best contraception. And you could see that there can be a positive feedback, a virtuous circle, that as a population becomes richer, there are many reasons why it will have fewer children. Having fewer children allows the population to become richer by investing more per child. And that is a positive dynamic that goes along with the demographic transition. Whenever you have a bicausal relationship, if you have the right shape of the curves, you can also have a trap and a threshold phenomenon. And to put that same bicausal relationship the other way, it can be the case that a population is so poor that it does not have fertility control, and the lack of fertility control means that it remains impoverished. And that is what's called the demographic poverty trap. And it's a real phenomenon. It's not a sole explanation of poverty, but it is definitely a major factor in very poor countries and very poor regions to either amplify or postpone the escape from poverty, or to add tremendously the difficulty of escape from poverty. The fact is, of course, as Joel pointed out, that fertility rates in middle-income and high-income countries are either already at or below the replacement rate, or approaching the replacement rate rapidly from above, whereas the high fertility rates remain in the poorest countries. And in a way you see those traps, because in the very poorest countries, many of the factors which lead to high fertility, of course, absence of family planning services, rurality rather than urbanization, the fact that populations are living in rural areas, which itself is conducive to the choice of larger families, high child mortality rates, which lead families to resist having fewer children out of fear that their children won't survive, girls not being able to reach secondary education and thereby neither delay the onset of childbearing nor be empowered in their societies to have the choice that they would like to make. All of these things mean that in many poor places in the world, there is a massive demographic crisis right now. And this shows up in the baseline so-called medium fertility forecasts of the UN Population Division for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is expected to rise from about 7% of the world's population in 1950 to this admittedly a very wide range of uncertainty forecast for 2100 of being 1/3 of the world's population. And the third most populous country predicted by the UN as of 2100 is Nigeria, on the medium forecast to have 750 million Nigerians compared to roughly 150 million today. I think what Manu said, the chance of that happening in a viable, sustainable way is awfully small, but it indicates how much tremendous population momentum there is right now. And I just want to close by saying this poverty trap presents also an opportunity to end that trap through targeted interventions. And the ones that Joel mentioned, I think, are the ones to focus on, helping ensure that everybody, and especially girls, can get through a secondary education, help to ensure that children survive. That is a stabilizing measure, not a destabilizing measure. It encourages the fertility transition. Make sure that agricultural productivity rises along with agricultural technology, thereby breaking the poverty trap, having a smaller population in rural areas, more in urban areas, and speeding the demographic transition. These are, and of course, helping there to be a health care and family planning system with culturally sensitive methods and community health workers to help along the way. These are ways to break that poverty demography trap.
Great. Well, I want to pick up on some of those thoughts, and we'll throw it open into more of a conversation at this point. But Joel, I wanted to first come back and ask you about an issue which I think comes out of a number of the comments, but particularly Jeff's comment, which is, you've talked about these population predictions for the future. What range of uncertainty, should we be open to? I mean, how much can we say for sure, and how much do we really feel there are different scenarios that could be wildly different in their outcomes?
The range of, first of all, may I digress for just a moment to thank my colleagues for these wise remarks, which I wish I had made, but I had limited time. And I thought all of these were really on target. I would like to address briefly, but not this moment, but Ruth's very good point about how do we deal with the rising consumption as fertility seems to be coming slowly under control. I think that's an important question which I'd like to come back to, but I want to address your question first. So, but thank you, colleagues, because you're continuing my education, and that's great. The UN prepares a number of projections, of which 3 are the most relevant here. The medium projection that Jeff was just talking about, and all of us have mainly been talking about, assumes a gradual conversion toward the replacement level of about 2.1 children per woman per lifetime, from above by the high fertility countries, from below by the low fertility countries. The evidence that that will actually happen is rather meager. If you assume a fertility of half, and by the way, that projection gets us to about, I think, 10 or 10.5 billion people in 2100. 2100, okay? If you assume half a child more per woman per lifetime through this period, you get to a population of about 15 plus billion. If you assume half a child less than the median projection, you get to a population in 2100 of about 6.1 billion. So 6.1, 10, 15. Now 6.1 is where we were in 2001. That's how many people, or 2000, okay? So basically, the low projection would be an arch bridge. And I think that is a trajectory devoutly to be desired. Although there are many people who regard a decline in population with alarm. I think the problems of a decline are easier to deal with than the problems of a continuing rise.
This is a very interesting point, because I was picking up on Ruth's comment that, in some ways we should view 7 billion as a success for the species. But, maybe from a policy point of view, should we be saying, let's try and get it down from this point, or let's make 8 billion the max we ever get to? I mean, what do you think? You actually think we should be embracing the goal of population reduction over the next century?
I think we should be embracing the goal of empowering women to decide how many children they want, and of educating women to make good decisions about how many children they want.
So that tells me you're either a brilliant politician or by not answering the question,
I'm telling you.
But I want to push you on this, because I think it is a 7
I've never been called a politician before.
7 billion. I mean, there is something about it that it captures the point very, very clearly that we're growing in our demands that we place on the planet, and it's a very clear metric of whether we're succeeding or not as to whether we start to see the population come down. And so I'm just wondering whether it is an organizing theme that we should go around, or is it one that we should alternatively say, let's just focus on these different policy areas that we've talked about, and kind of whatever the population results from that, we should just stick to that. And Jeff wants to come in on this question.
Can I just make a comment?
No, please.
I think we should keep in mind the counterfactual. Where would we be today if fertility had not fallen by half since 1950 or 60? We would be, maybe, I'm guessing, because I don't remember the exact numbers, 5 to 7 billion people more. So, in a sense, I share Ruth's sentiment that this is a triumph, but it's a triumph looked at from above rather than from below, that we've achieved 7 billion. What we have managed to avoid achieving is 12 billion. I'll leave it to Jeff.
Of course, this is one of the most sensitive questions, socially, individually, and politically on the planet. And it's worth recalling that for a long time there was no sense of policy about this at all. Then gradually, starting in the 1950s and 60s, there was a recognition for the first time of the dramatic rate of population increase, and there was an active sense that the population should be stabilized through promoting the idea of replacement rate or reduction of fertility rates. Then there were definitely excesses in some places with coercion, and there were also backlashes of various major religious groups and so forth, which rejected the idea that there should be standards. And so the world in 1994 at a world governments, I should say, at a major summit in Cairo, dropped the notion of population being a target at all and went to a formulation not unlike Joel's, which is empowerment and choice.
Educated choice.
Educated choice. And I want to carefully, gingerly push a little bit back towards population. That I think that we need to have a sense of how difficult the circumstances are on the planet as a whole, how hard it will be to avoid a hard landing for hundreds of millions of people right now because of climate and many other considerations. We are in a kind of overshooting mode, quite potentially, for a not small part of the world, and it could be a quite large part of the world. And I think that the fact of that, it may come down to the same thing in some sense, but unless we're more upfront about the need and the importance of trying to stabilize, say, at 8 billion or below, we're not going to get those informed choices, if you want to put it that way, for full harmony. Or I would even push a little bit farther to say that governments should look towards goals, not through coercion, because it's not necessary, but through active policies to say we need to move from 5 to 3 and towards stability for our own good and as part of a global good. So I'd like to see population come back as a focus, and not only as a side effect, but actually as a focus. But there's a lot of pushback and a lot of unhappiness with that view. But I think that it's quite important.
Yeah, I guess the history, as you say, of efforts to control population have been so ghastly over the years that you can see why there's that reluctance.
But if you start with stabilization, I think it's the actual number at which we stabilize, unless it's orders of magnitude off where we are, is probably not quite as critical. Keep in mind, the population in India is more than the population in Africa today. So there are places in the world which could handle more population, but so I'm not that concerned whether the number in the end is 6 or 7 or 10 billion. But if it becomes 20, 30, or 40, we have a really big problem. So stabilization, I think, is really the central goal. And I do think the good news is that if you go into countries where people have a strong economic background and are well educated, you seem to be below replacement quite typically. So there's an optimistic part in me. If we just put things in place, this will happen.
Ruth, do you want to comment on this?
Well, I would comment that whether there is a desired number for population, whether it's desirable to reduce or to stabilize or whatever the desired number is, as Joel said, there really is no answer. It's really a question of, are there the resources that will support a good life, choice, and freedom to exercise options and so on, for whatever number that is. So I'm not sure we can approach it by what the number is, but approach it by what are the resources available in the way that we choose to use resources that can support the number. That said, there's clearly an overshoot and a high number which we clearly cannot support currently in the way that we use resources today.
That's why this is a hard problem. It's both the most intimate of problems, what people do in their beds, and it's the most public and global of problems, because what people do in their beds has externalities that affect people who aren't in bed with them. And it's hard to think about all of these levels simultaneously. But it's essential that we begin to do so. And the tension, which is not really a tension because basically I agree with Jeff that population is important, but the way we go about it, if we go about it by empowering people to make good choices and encouraging them through incentives of the kind that economists are very experienced with, we could do much better than we are doing at trying to get where we think we want to go. The problem is not the remote future, but that 3.4 billion people today are living on less than $2 a day. That wealth is not helping improve that problem to the extent that it could, and that we know a lot more than we're actually using. That's the problem. It's the foregone opportunity of all those children I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia who could be Columbia students but aren't. And that's a cost that our economic systems do not incorporate. We've got to do something about that.
Manu, you were earlier conjuring with the idea that we could even sustain 20 billion people on the planet. I just want to get a sense of what you would think would have to happen for that to be the case. No, I'm not
suggesting we try to sustain that many people.
But you certainly raised the possibility that you could imagine a world in which that was sustainable.
What I'm driving at there is similar to what Klaus is saying, which is unless there is an effective constraint put in front of that particular trajectory, it will get there. And it may get there. We could have speculated whether we would be at 7 billion today or not. And we are. So I think we can look at those sort of numbers. They could happen, and it may be technological possible for the Earth to support that many people. And the point I was making earlier, in a way, can be said as, if you look at resource scarcity, which is what this basically comes to, and I'm including the environment as a resource, it's a problem that is going to be faced primarily by the poor. And that's where the division is. So even if we try to mandate stabilization, getting it to take place in the areas we are today most concerned about is the question. How do you achieve that? And if you look at it from a resource scarcity end and the climate and water variability issue in Africa particularly, I just don't see how that's going to be matched unless there is research which is targeted specifically at coming up with appropriate low-cost solutions to move these people towards productivity. And that's the sense of empowerment that I think Joel is talking about that moves them out of that trap. If we don't do that, and many of the solutions we've been seeing, for example, in water and agriculture, they aim for water conservation, they aim for increased agricultural productivity, but they are targeted at a business model that is typically very developed country, very expensive. This is not going to work, and we don't see much efforts directed towards the kind of change that can happen on the ground in the other areas.
See, the conundrum you have is that even if population stops growing, your resource demand could easily grow by a factor 5 to 10, right? And that first factor 5 is simply saying everybody else will catch up to the standard of living we take for granted. Right? If then throw a little extra growth in, you are at a factor 10. So that you have to deal with. And now I think what both Manu and I are saying from a technology point of view, if you take best available practices today, I would argue with the possible exception of energy, which is not quite there but could be there, you could actually do that, and possibly even a little more. I think a lot of the problem is how do you get from here to there, and that is actually not pushing technology, but it's pushing the social institutions which are required to make that transition, and that is by far the more difficult problem. And that's why I'm not so concerned whether we stop at 7 or 10 billion people, because I think you can adjust to either.
Jean-Marie, I mean, how do we sell this as a national security issue? Because, I mean, in a sense, what we're hearing is that, and what you alluded to, was that if we get the kind of population growth that seems to be likely on current policy, that there is going to be a growing amount of violence that results from this, and presumably some threat to the most developed nations, as well as within the regions where poverty is concentrated. What would be the case you would make to Western policymakers about how they manage this as a national security issue?
Well, at one level, the instinct would be just the opposite, actually. You live in an aging, rich country surrounded by neighbors who are growing much faster and growing fast while you are shrinking. You will see national policies to try to promote, to support more children, to build the population. That's an old tradition, and I think to fight that, you really need to manage a very cooperative relationship. And I think the example of Europe-Africa is a good one, because I think you can convince leaders in Europe that on the one hand it's a good thing for the Europeans to accept some immigration, to have a balance between the working population and the aging non-working population. On the other hand, it's unmanageable to have massive immigration. It will trigger more xenophobia the kind of reaction that we have seen in a number of places. So if you don't want that, you need to have a more comprehensive policy with your African partners so that they are empowered, as Joel was saying, and also that they also benefit from a number of investment and open trade and a number of things that goes beyond population that bring them closer to an aging continent, but not in a threatening way. So I think it's a lot about political communication, because the immediate gut reaction will be to say we should make more children so that we can compete. No, but we are not a shrinking, too fast shrinking percentage of world population. If you're Russia, for instance, with the whole emptiness of the Asian part of Russia, the incentive to try to have more people there is very strong. So how do you manage that with your Asian neighbors? That's something that needs to be dealt with politically.
Because certainly in Europe, you hear more and more politicians talk about how the continent is kind of collectively committing suicide by not reproducing itself, and I guess Silvio Berlusconi is making a one-man effort to change that around in Italy. But apart from this does seem to be a question whether maybe we've had an overshoot in the rich world, and in terms of correcting fertility downwards, and an overshoot in the poor world in the other direction. But I think probably the balance of policy would say, well, let's try and make the best of that by bringing more immigration. Jeff, you want to come in?
Yeah, I want to come back and express just a little more urgency again in the discussion, because I think there are several points that lead me to that conclusion. First, even aside from the levels of population, these high fertility rates are major barriers to development. I say even aside from the level of population, the high fertility rates are major barriers to living standards and development. Given that, that's a rate of change, not a level, but given the fact of the high fertility rates, this is one of the destabilizing factors in many of the places that indeed are already in violence and are already in very, very serious crisis. Second, I think there are places that have already reached a level of population that in a context of a rapidly changing climate and degraded environment are at a crisis point of tremendous severity. And I think of the Horn of Africa, for example. Somalia's population has risen roughly fivefold since the middle of the 20th century. Precipitation is down roughly 25% over the last quarter century. There's a devastating famine underway right now because of 2 years of complete failure of rains and the potential that this is already entering a period of long-term climate change. We don't know, but at least there are plausible cases of that. That's a region that is already at the edge of survival. And one could say, yes, with optimal technologies, things can be better. And indeed, we'll try our best at the Earth Institute, working with these governments in a program on helping to develop the drylands. But it's tough. It's just about the hardest challenge in the whole world. Then I would say from the world as a whole, we're not adequately taking into account how objectively unsustainable we already are at the current levels of population and production. So we're not on a baseline that is going to get that is sustainable but going to become unsustainable. We're on a baseline which is already creating massive crises in climate, in water, and in many other areas, and India among them. It may be true that the Green Revolution raised productivity tremendously, but we also know that in the breadbasket of the Green Revolution, there's a catastrophic water crisis. There are solutions, but whether you reach the solutions is a major challenge. Now, all of this, I would agree with everybody that population is one factor, and per capita use of resources is probably an even bigger factor. So it's not all on the population numbers. But I think, as Joel said, a lower population or stabilizing at a lower population would sure help these unsolved conundrums right now. It's not as if we have any assurance that that middle area is going to be reached. We can all imagine how it might be, but we have absolutely no evidence over the last 20 years that we've accomplished anything on the climate change, for example. I would argue globally, we can see the failures of institutions, the failures of politics, the failures of communication, of science, and so many fronts, and the world's barreling forward. So I just want to say I'm not so sanguine that sure 10, sure 15, doesn't quite matter where. I would say we're in a pretty serious state of affairs right now.
Let me push you a bit on that, because it seems to me there are two questions that are pretty urgent. I mean, one is this point that I think you also made, Joel, was that in fact a lot of the problems come out of our failure in democracies, in mature democracies, to actually regulate our own behavior to make it sustainable. And there seems to be, certainly in America, perhaps less so in Europe, but still pretty bad in Europe, a complete failure to address the cost of carbon that we're using, real inability to come up with a sensible energy policy, and so forth. And that the challenge may be, how much can we change that? How do we change that quickly? Can we improve the quality of scientific discussion in our democracies so people really take seriously the threats that we face? But then the second issue, you could say, well, perhaps rationally we've concluded in the rich world that we're not going to be able to sort our own problems out, so let's at least stop the next phase of the problem, which is this dramatic population increase in sub-Saharan Africa, which you might, you've articulated a strategy through education, contraception and so forth that, were it to be very aggressively pursued, could possibly lead to quite a dramatic reduction in fertility through the empowerment of women, empowered choice, informed choice, and so forth. And yet we're at a point where, in fact, we're about to cut our aid budgets dramatically, I think, over the next 5 or 10 years. And so, again, for, I think, reasons that relate directly to the inability of our own democracies in mature countries to actually have a intelligent, fact-based conversation about what's going on. So, I mean, what on earth can we do to change that debate? I mean, do you have any... Ruth, you write about how do we information and science in the public discussion of it. What can we do to change this discussion? Ruth.
Wow, why are you asking me that question? I'm struck by Joel's his diagram with the social institutions at the middle level, not the global level and the local level, but that's really where we're missing, and that's where a lot of these institutions that promote resource use or contraception or thinking and implementation of what comes out of science happens, and that's really where, as Joel said, there's a big hole right now.
And do you think you could, this is why I think the goal of talking about population, as Jeff alluded to, it does actually, it provides a focus to say, look, 7 billion to 8 billion is something that we're not going to be able to sustain. Does that, if we were to focus on that as a topic, would that in some way enable us to change the conversation more broadly about these other policies, do you think, or not?
I think it needs to be disaggregated from the global number because the issues are just so different in different parts of the world. In our part of the world, we have low population and high per capita consumption. In other parts of the world, it's the other way around. So when we keep the level at the discussion at that very global number, then I think we really miss the importance of what actions need to be taken at that sort of middle social institution ground that Joel was talking about.
Jeff, do you want to come in on that broader point?
Well, I think there's just no doubt that this is among the most terribly difficult discussions conceivable in the world. That's, I think, one of the reasons why we don't have a very good discussion. If we say it's really important for in a low-income country to reduce fertility, there's immediately a reaction that says you're just trying to keep the planet for yourself. This is another example of selfishness. Many accusations around such a heated topic get made, and so it's, as Joel said, and I think it's quite obvious, it's about the most emotive of topics imaginable in the world. We've got to have the discussion, though, however, because it's also one of the most important.
Joel.
I just want to come back to Ruth's question about consumption. The material intensity of GDP has been declining. What does that mean? It means the pounds of carbon burned, the pounds of steel used per dollar of GDP has been going down. But the GDP has been going up so fast that the absolute amount of consumption in many cases has been rising. The challenge is to get our economic measures of well-being to measure what is important, I'll come back to that in a second, and then to change technologies so that we can produce well-being as measured by economic indices or other indices with less material throughput. So I see the threat as material throughput, not growth in well-being. And our GDP adds a positive for every prison we build. Our GDP adds a positive for a mother who hires a nanny while she goes out and works, but doesn't give credit to the mother if she stays home and takes care of the child herself. Our GDP is a distortion of where we want to go, and yet for many politicians, it is the holy grail. I done good for my country because I raised GDP. That is so far from reality. The GDP is an income measure, and it does not measure the depredations of wealth that the mining of assets, human, material, environmental, that may go into producing current income. We need a more integrated accounting system that says, if I give up wetlands to make current income because I can build houses on that plot of land, there's a cost as well as the income that I produce. Our accounting systems are all off, and they're giving us incentives that lead us astray. And I may say this, you know the definition of a demographer? It's a person who has a flair for numbers but doesn't have the personality to be a bookkeeper. So I'm not an economist, but I do see this very severe problem with our measures of economic well-being.
I think that's a very useful comment. I think it's very striking that since the economic crisis, all 20 of the G20 countries have now got initiatives underway to try and broaden the measures that they use beyond GDP. And I think it's very important that we hold them to account to actually come up with some of those models that they promised. But let's take some questions from the...
I didn't know that, and I'm glad you said it. I just learned something.
There's some questions from the audience. So, first one, many of the panelists have noticed that have noted the issues of finite resources and increasing consumption. Yet the only solutions to this problem that have been noted are an increase in more efficient technologies. And then the questioner says, in the likely event that these technologies do not do the trick, what other solutions are there? And I want to ask, is the questioner right to be skeptical that it is unlikely that we will come up with those technological improvements? And then let the questioner ask as well that, what are the alternatives if we can't get technological improvements? Mano, why don't you take it first?
The interesting thing is that as far as the efficiency of technologies is concerned, it's even an issue of adoption. Many people think that, so I'll give you a comment that I received from the President's Advisory Council on Science and Technology when I gave a talk to them. And what they asked me was that we are interested in water and agriculture in the United States. We understand that in a developing country, you could improve efficiency a lot and you could get out of it. But in the United States, we have reached the limit because we must be really efficient, so we are in trouble. Surprisingly for them, the answer is that 53% of the United States agriculture that practices irrigation uses flood irrigation, the same as in India, with the same 10 to 15% efficiency. So we are not there. So the point I'm making is that the first goal, and Klaus alluded to this also, is getting behavior changes out of people to use some of these things. It's odd that in the face of abject resource scarcity, people are using techniques which are inferior to others that are available. It doesn't speak to market mechanisms in a sense.
That's because water is not priced properly
Yes,
in the
I know.
American West. You have hereditary water rights,
Yeah.
and you don't pay in a market for water. If the farmers had to bargain for water against the cities and industries, you better believe that they would be more efficient, because right now they're getting a free ride for political and historical reasons.
Joel, it goes beyond that. The United States has now recognized the human right to water. That doesn't include the human right to pay for water.
Thank you.
Okay. So a second question we've got here from Evie at the Jakarta Post. So voluntary birth control seems unfair. It's like giving all the responsibilities to the poor countries. I appreciate Ruth mentioning consumption. Don't you think that voluntary consumption control would help promote sustainability as much as birth control? Ruth?
Well, voluntary consumption is very difficult because people like to consume. That's in our nature. I think we need to be thinking about, rather than thinking about reducing consumption, although there is plenty of scope to reduce consumption in our part of the world, to be able to improve the efficiency with which resources are consumed. For example, there is a lot of scope. Joel was talking about food production and agriculture and clearing forests for agriculture, to, instead of clearing forests, to expand agriculture into lands that have already been cleared, that are not being used as efficiently, as productively as they can. So I think there's a long way to go with thinking about how we improve the efficiency of resource consumption that does not necessarily involve reducing consumption. Although there are some aspects of reducing consumption which would benefit, for example, eating meat in our part of the world. If people ate less meat, they would both improve their health and they would reduce their consumption.
I'll bring Jeff in on this, but I know in Britain and France there are experiments now being undertaken where people are told about their energy consumption in their houses and encouraged to consume less, and by being compared to their neighbours and so forth. So the state is trying to change how people perceive themselves as consumers, and maybe there's a lot more we could do to get people to benchmark themselves differently in high consumption societies so they don't consume so much. What do you think?
Well, I think the question is not right, actually. So I'm going to go after the question, not the answer.
Okay.
Because the question implies, and it's a very common assumption, that why should we reduce fertility? Why don't you reduce consumption? As if a situation where poor people in rural areas having 7 or 8 children, that's their prerogative, don't bother us. As if that's somehow good for their children and good for the society, and not a reflection of a trap of a certain kind of poverty, lack of access to family planning, lack of access to schooling, and lack of a direction that can work for their societies. If you look at the countries with fertility rates of 7 or 8, I wouldn't call it a privilege to be in Somalia right now, and I wouldn't call it a privilege to be a young child in Chad right now, and I wouldn't call it a privilege to be one of those 8 in many places. The parents may do it for whatever reason. They may do it because they think many children will die. They may do it because there's no contraception within 100 kilometers available, that there are no functioning clinics. They may do it because a mother has never been to a school and the choices aren't known. And many people don't know the choices, actually. When it's explained to them, It's sometimes said things that may seem absolutely obvious. Oh, it's never been explained to us this way, that if we had 3 children rather than 6, our children would be better off. And here's why. It seems maybe self-evident to some, not to others. I think that question reflects what happens at our political level in a debate. This isn't, why don't you do it, why don't you do it, but a situation where expecting at the current state of affairs, with the land and climate change crises and densities already quite high on fragile ecosystems, that a fertility rate of 6 or 7 or 8 can be sustained productively and be good for those kids, I think is a big mistake.
Okay, there's a question from the audience. In January of this year, 4 UN agencies working on behalf of women and girls combined to form a single entity, UN Women, with the goal of achieving gender equality and economic improvement. And the question says, well, what projects would you suggest that UN Women focuses on to help women make more informed decisions about the number of children that they should have? And maybe, Carl, do you want to go first on that? Klaus, sorry.
Not. I think probably the wrong person to.
Well, you have lots of experience in the world. What would you recommend in terms of how we change women's empowerment?
Well, I do think it comes down to having choices and being able to make these choices and get them through. And I think that's one of the big political issues in some of the countries where women are not educated, right? So I think that education, in my view, is therefore the most important thing to pursue.
And why do you think we've failed to get enough education reform? I mean, are we now at a point where we're reaching political resistance to reform, or is it more about a lack of resources and so forth?
I think it depends a little where you go, but I do believe Jeff is right about the poverty trap. I mean, you can get caught at a point where you cannot move forward. And if you have 8, 9 children on average, you're probably way too busy to worry about these things, and then you are stuck in a cultural background where it's very hard to make the next step, and that is truly a trap. And so I think you saw Joel's numbers about what these things would cost. It's a drop in a bucket, and I think that's another new thing in this world. The rich countries actually would have the resources to solve the problem if we'd only put our mind to it.
Ruth, what would you advise in terms of how we really change things on women's empowerment?
This isn't my area of expertise, but from just observation that it seems like the really critical piece to empowering women is providing job opportunities and the income opportunities, which has a empowerment and education, and the value of education then is achieved. And if girls and women have that opportunity for generating income and opportunity to jobs, then I think that we see a rather rapid decline in fertility.
Joel?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'd like to give an example of what Jean-Marie was talking about, of an enlightened collaboration. The problem began in Senegal, which had tremendously rich fisheries off of its coast. Because the cold currents came up, there were plankton there, and there were these huge fish, famous from the 17th century. You could walk across the sea of fish, they used to say. So global fishing companies came and scooped up all the fish with factory boats that operated offshore. The local onshore fishermen, who have these motorboat-powered canoes, basically, were not able, in a month of fishing, to catch what they used to catch in 4 days of fishing. Well, those people are not stupid, so they found a more profitable line of work using the skills they already had. namely smuggling Senegalese who came to the port cities to the Canary Islands, where they would dump them, if the trip was successful, without papers, so that they could not be repatriated. So the Senegalese who were dumped in the Canary Islands were taken to mainland Spain and got jobs and lived there. So this flow built up to thousands. Finally, the Spanish awoke. It was Spanish and EU policy that had subsidized the European fishing industry that helped deplete the Senegalese fisheries. Not only the Korean fisheries, not only the Chinese, but the European fisheries were depleting the Senegalese. So the Spanish woke up and said, okay, we are going to start a training program in Senegal to give people education and jobs at home in Senegal, and for those people who don't illegally enter Spain through the Canary Islands, we will give 1,000 permits a year to work in jobs in Spain. So the incentive is stay home, get trained, get one of those permits, work in Spain, or get a job at home. This is an example of what Jean-Marie was talking about, an intelligent collaboration that builds the resources in Senegal, benefits Spain because they get these workers. Those people are working like crazy because they want to keep those jobs. And there's a kind of a win-win. But what I want to point out is that there's an ecological element to it. The fisheries were overfished. There's the draining of people from the interior of Senegal to the port cities because of climate change. They're the poor fishermen who were fished out by the multinational fisheries. And then there was a semi-enlightened response.
I was going to just stress that it's only semi-enlightened because the Europeans didn't say, we'll stop overfishing your waters.
They tried to negotiate a fisheries treaty. This has been less than completely successful.
Jeff, let's talk a bit more about the empowering of women and how, what practically can be done to quickly to change where we are.
I think without question the most important starting point is secondary education, and this is a theme that Joel has led on with David Bloom at Harvard University, the idea that the Millennium Development Goals reflect the low aspirations of donor countries in a way, because the second of the 8 goals is universal primary education. But that's a pretty low target in this world today, and it doesn't solve the fertility problem really, because if girls make it through 7 or 8 years of schooling, but then at age 12 or 13 can't go on because there's no money and there's no opportunity, then they can still get married at age 14 and find themselves living in a life of poverty and ending up with few choices in their lives and with a lot of kids. And so the idea that we should be moving to universal secondary education as a basic norm everywhere. And as Joel showed, the costs are absurdly low in a certain way, and tragically low in another way because we don't do it. But this, I think, is one fact. Of course, everything in development always should provoke many kinds of responses, not just one. So I would put that on the top of the list. But women are the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa for staple crops. And raising productivity raises incomes and enables also another route to escape from poverty and from this demographic poverty trap. So agriculture is another component. Improved infrastructure is another component. If you don't have to walk hours for water and for fuel wood, productivity rises, empowerment rises, and so there are many ways into a poverty trap. And since so much of the 7 or 8 child per woman phenomenon really is a phenomenon of extreme poverty, there are many ways in that can change that reality and end up with a long-term improvement of quality of life for, of course, for the woman and for the current parents, but also especially for the children.
Great. And I'm very pleased by campaigns like the Elders campaign to end child marriage, which seems to me to be a very important way to try and change the debate in a number of countries, where if you could end that practice alone, you probably would start to have a serious impact on the number of people women under the age of 16 giving birth to children, which would help a lot. A question from Rick H. from Twitter. To what degree are GMO foods going to be needed if we're going to actually feed the population of the world? Because this is, I guess, a very controversial area that genetically modified food seems to it's claimed to be much more robust for growing in impoverished countries at the moment. Upmal.
We might need them. On the other hand, today we have about 30 to 35% loss in food grains post-production before it gets to anybody. So, you look at that and you say, why do you need some of the other things? Today, if you look at the Indian example that, Jeff was mentioning, India went from a famine-prone country to a country where 6% of the land mass provides 50% of the total production of food grains and food. Of course, at a cost, but you look at that and you can say you can spread this around. So I think there's a tremendous amount of improvement that can occur without GMOs. On the other hand, there are many attributes of GMOs that make them very attractive in terms of reduction of application of pesticides, fertilizers, and water. So the question is, why would you not take that on? And there are arguments that are advanced against that. And the question that is open in my mind is, selectively, instead of branding all GMOs as good or bad, selectively, are there things that we can take which are perhaps feasible with the GMOs that allow you to transcend forward? And the answer is yes. Are there things that we can do with genetic modification that are game changers? For example, being able to grow rice in the ocean margin rather than inside. If we start reaching population numbers like 10, 12, 15 billion people on the planet, the question is, will we be able to make it without taking part in such technologies? And I think the answer will be difficult at that stage.
Anyone else want to come in on that, or Jeff?
Just a word that it's a class of technology, not a specific crop or a specific variety, and I think it would be a huge mistake to rule out a large class of technological know-how, because some of the most interesting things that are being looked at right now are using this technology for heat stress, which is something that is going to come with the increasing temperatures, salinization stress, flooding stress. So there are many varieties, for example, a so-called sub-1 gene, which has been worked on by the International Rice Research Institute and incorporated into a popular high-yield rice variety in Asia, which is allowing Bangladeshi farmers now to have a rice crop that survives a flood. This is a huge benefit for very poor people living in the delta in Bangladesh, and to rule that out as a category would be a huge mistake. So I think that there's a lot of fear, perhaps understandable, but the fear can be reduced by explaining the kinds of applications. There's also a lot of fear about the property rights issues, and those also can be solved by all manner of policy choices. But as a knowledge area, to rule out this whole area of genetic modification would be, in my view, a huge closing of the door to potential benefits.
Unfortunately, our time is pretty much up, but I'm going to ask each of our panelists as we finish if they could come up with, we'll answer two questions, I guess, which are very short questions, which are really to say, if you could see one change over the next year that would make you feel we were making a significant step in the right direction, what would that change be? And I'm going to ask it twice, because I'm going to ask, firstly, in a rich country like America, what change would you like to see in America? And then the other would be, what would you like to see in the developing world that you start to see change that would really make a difference? So I'm going to start with you, Joel, and just go down the line.
You sure you don't want to start with Jeff?
Start with America.
Okay. I'd like to see an all-out effort to prevent unintended pregnancies and unintended births. 48% of our pregnancies are unintended, millions of our births. I'd like to see that.
And then the developing world.
Yeah, stop. Developing world. I guess I'd like to see universal secondary education, the point that Jeff made. I've been working on that for well over a decade. I see the benefits. I think the costs are minimal. It would make a revolution around the world in a peaceful and productive way. If we could do that, I'd be really happy.
Ruth.
Developing first?
Yep.
I think in the developing world, the institutions at the national scale to think seriously and engage all of the stakeholders in what path of development can be followed that is sustainable. At the developed world,
So-called.
yes, as someone asked Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a good idea. At the developed world, the incentives in place for corporations to look at their whole supply chain and where all of their resources are getting sourced from, and have incentives in place to make their supply chain as sustainable as it can be.
Great, thank you. Jean-Marie.
Developed world, maybe focus on energy, but you know more about it than I do. But I would think that there are many places where the ratio of energy to GNP could be significantly changed, and that would make a big difference. In the developing world, actually in the relationship between the developed and the developing world, I would want to see more attention paid to the traditional social structures in development efforts, not looking just as the facade of the state. I think a lot of our failures come because we talk to interlocutors who don't have a real grip on the societies that we want to help.
Amani?
In the developing world, I'm going to go out and say something partly ridiculous. I think there should be efforts to pay women not to have children, or to cap it at a certain number of children. And the logic that I have here is that, in a way, if you could create a bank account for women and they become the financial managers of the household, and it is tied in some sense to reproductive success thereof, that could be a game changer. Because traditionally, for example, in a country like India, women had gold and assets come with them, and that was essentially their way of managing what their outcomes could be. And I think we need to create something similar. For the developed world, I think what I would like to see is a recognition that it's a global partnership, and they have to really invest in the developing countries in terms of developing the human resources in those countries. And the development of those human resources, I think, in turn leads to better outcomes for environmental resources. Part of what I mean by that is that if you look at experience in Africa or India, primary inputs needed for someone to manufacture anything, whether it's agricultural or whatever, cost more in India than they do in the United States. And they cost more in Africa than they do in India. This does not lead to a sustainable business model, first off. So if that can be reversed by appropriate investment, that would help.
Klaus.
Starting with the developed countries, particularly maybe the US, I think we need to learn how to deal with this question of sustainability and don't shy away from climate change figure out how to have a price on carbon, deal with energy systems that way, and also understand that the sustainability is not just reduce consumption, because I think we'll never solve the problem that way, but at 7 billion people, we are relying heavily on technology, and we end up relying more if we really want to make things sustainable, and that dialogue hasn't been had yet. If you now go into the developing countries, and it depends where you go, if you go to the end of the spectrum there, I think you have such a crying emergency that I think probably the real answer is that if we can get the developed countries to push harder and help harder, because they are in a trap and they won't come out by themselves.
And Jeff?
I think for all countries, 2012 ought to be the year where sustainable development finally comes to our agenda. In the United States, it might mean that Rupert Murdoch has so many problems defending himself in the UK that he stops propagandizing our country. And we are able to open our eyes to all of the things that we have failed to do for so long. And for the world as a whole, and the developing countries, so-called, which are 5/6 of humanity, when we come to Rio next June, that will be the 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit in 1992. And I think it will be fair to say that those 20 years since 3 major treaties on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification were signed in 1992 produced no results of discernible note over 20 years in true global movement towards sustainable development. And so when the world reassembles in Rio in June 2012, that it take note of this horrendous loss of time that has brought us closer to grave peril, and that we actually do something useful during the next 20 years.
And I guess from my point of view, I'd like to see the developed countries, as they debate the aid budget over the next 12 months, to really understand it less as a humanitarian gesture and more as an investment in a sustainable planet. And I think if we did view it in that way, we would want to put a lot more money into it than we're doing it at the moment, perhaps in different ways, but certainly we wouldn't be looking to cut the aid budget. And in a developing world, I guess I would like to see some real progress in terms of the political battle to empower women, taking some real steps forward, because I do think, again, so much would be unlocked if we could break through some of those very patriarchal systems of governance, often at the very local level, and really see the potential to change the world of having informed, empowered women. So I think it's been a great discussion, and I hope people watching here and throughout the world via live streaming have found it informative. And let's hope, I think, given our overall skepticism about the desirability of 8 billion, that it's a long time before we come back to discuss hitting the next billion target. So thank you very much for everyone.